Good morning, and thank you all for joining us, especially on a rainy morning. I'm Hadley Jensen, curator of Shaped by the Loom, and on behalf of Bard Graduate Center's founder and director, Susan Weber, and Dean Peter Miller, I'd like to welcome you to today's symposium. At BGC, we study the material world, seeking knowledge about the past and striving for critical understanding of our present and presence here. We respectfully acknowledge this place as Lenapehoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and recognize New York City as a past, present, and future home for many Indigenous people. Exhibition making is a key component of what we do at BGC, to invite new ways of knowing, to pose questions, and to tell stories. As many of you know, this exhibition has unfolded over 5 years, beginning in 2018 during my postdoctoral fellowship in museum anthropology, which was a joint appointment between BGC and the American Museum of Natural History. It takes many voices to tell this story, and I respectfully acknowledge all the people who have helped to bring this project to life, especially the speakers you'll be hearing from today. Collaborations with Indigenous artists, scholars, and curators have informed my methodologies and animated the exhibition in important ways, grounding the project in Diné knowledges, lifeways, and cultural teachings. Through this work, we strive to advance collaborative exhibition practices and to enable new forms of curatorial scholarship. Based on the geographic, ecological, and cultural specificity of the American Southwest, where I currently live and work, Shaped by the Loom aims to foster a greater cultural awareness and understanding of Navajo weaving by centering the perspectives of its practitioners, cultural producers, and communities. This art form has traversed temporal boundaries and encompassed many forms and practices, including vibrant contemporary expressions that are highlighted alongside historic examples from AM&H's collection. In bridging different cultures and systems of knowledge production, we reveal how these textiles have been and continue to be made, used, exchanged, altered, and valued over time. Diné weavers have often shared with me that most of the work of weaving happens before one even sits down at the loom. I began to wonder how to translate the relationship between thinking and making that guides the practice of Navajo weaving, and how to locate the material traces of these processes in museum collections. As an expression of animate landscapes, kinship networks, cosmological values, and lived experience, how could we make this expansive process explicit within the context of an exhibition? And how might we reveal what happens in the space between conception and labor, or idea and action, to bring Navajo weaving to life? Diné weaver Wesley Thomas offers one answer to this question. He explains, dahislo is the appropriate term for weaving in the abstract. In Navajo discourse, dahislo is a verb referring to the process of integrating the warp and weft in the art of weaving on a setup loom. The word does not change even when the weaving is completed and removed from the loom. This term applies during the full life of the dahislo. Dahislo requires embodied knowledge of techniques, designs, and patterns, as well as a deep understanding of the ecological and spiritual relations that guide textile production. Sheep herding and wool processing, the harvesting and preparation of dye plants, the construction of looms and other weaving tools, the cosmologies that inform a weaver's work, and the songs, stories, and prayers woven into every item. With this in mind, Shaped by the Loom is an invitation to explore the world of Navajo weaving through Indigenous aesthetics and languages of making. Today, you'll hear directly from the Diné scholars, artists, and curators whose work has fundamentally shaped this exhibition and widened its horizon. I would like to thank the American Museum of Natural History for facilitating this collaborative process. As the institutional home of the collection featured and shaped by the Loom, they have generously loaned many of the items on display in our gallery, hosted collections visits, and supported the vision and ever-expanding scope of this project. In recognition of our partnership with AMNH, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Whiteley, Curator of North American Ethnology, to join me at the podium.
Thank you, Hadley. I'm delighted to be here. So the AMNH and BARD Graduate Center have had a postdoc fellowship since 2008. Indeed, the first holder of it, Aaron Glass, is probably here. There he is. Has ushered in a whole series of really wonderful work, and so we're delighted for this partnership. And we hope that it continues into the future. We've taken a hiatus for a couple of years, in part because of COVID and so forth. But it's just a wonderful opportunity for the American Museum of Natural History to be able to take advantage of this. We have a large institution. We move at a glacial pace. We finally renovated the Northwest Coast Hall, which I urge you all to go see while you're in New York. We're very pleased with it. We had 10 Indigenous advisors and one full co-curator, and we're generally speaking totally delighted with the result. But that took us 100 years before, yeah. So we don't move very fast. So it's not easy to have, say, smaller temporary exhibits. We did have one about 20 years ago called Totems to Turquoise, which focused on contemporary jewelry arts from the Southwest, where our curator was Jesse Mananya, and from the Northwest Coast, where the curator was Jim Hart from Haida. We were able to bring out 2 Navajo textiles in association with that. But that doesn't happen very often. So this association with BARD enables the showing of parts of the collection on a much more nimble basis. And it's just truly wonderful to see this current exhibit. So the collection of Navajo textiles is like one of the museum's best kept secrets. It's really a wonderful collection. I've had visiting researchers say this is the best collection east of the Mississippi and maybe west of the Mississippi too. There is historical material going into the 1850s, a dozen years before the Long Walk. It continues on up through the early 1900s, and in recent years we've been able to add a few other pieces as funds have become available. But there's some really wonderful stuff. And the material that's been selected for this exhibit by Hadley and collaborators is just some of the best of it. It's fabulous stuff. So I'm delighted to see that at last, 5 years on since Hadley was my postdoc. So I'm delighted also on a personal level. Those of you who don't know me, most of my work as an anthropologist has been with the Hopi. I've lived in a Hopi village for about 3 years, Bakavi on Third Mesa. And that takes a straight line from my first visit from England to the Southwest. This is pretty scary to say this, 50 years ago in 1972. And one of the places that I went and stayed for a few days was the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff. And I vividly remember turning a corner in M&A and seeing this amazing eye-dazzler textile and just, stopped in my tracks. And I thought, this reminds me of op art Bridget Riley and all that was a big thing in the UK at that time, all the op artists. And later I learned that they had actually been specifically influenced by some Navajo eye dazzler techniques and artistic representations. So anyway, that kind of stayed with me, and I thought, I want to come back here. So after I went to college in the UK, I applied to grad school at UNM in Albuquerque, the only place I applied to, because that's the only place I wanted to be. And started going to Pueblo and Navajo places, Chinle, Canyon de Chelly, Ganado, Tuba City, everywhere else. Well, not everywhere else, but a few other places too. And just, increasingly fell in love with the area, with the peoples of the area, and just wanted to stick around for a while. So I did that. And as I say, eventually I ended up working at Hopi on the history of Bakavi village in collaboration with the village, and produced a couple of books that talk about that and the history of Ojaivi on Third Mesa too. But as well as being fascinated by the material culture, I started learning a little bit more about its background. And I was particularly taken with an analysis by Gary Witherspoon, who's a Bilagana, a non-native, a white guy, but married to a Navajo woman, and he became fluent in Navajo, which is very unusual. Navajo is a complex language. It's by no means easy for a speaker of a standard average European language, as Worf would put it, to learn that. But he became, as far as I understand, pretty fluent. And he made the connection between Navajo aesthetics and the language itself. And importantly, he really stressed how, again, the contrast with standard average European languages, the emphasis upon verbs as opposed to nouns, processes as opposed to things. So he argued that the principal verb in Navajo is not the verb to be, it's the verb to go. And more than that, he calculated, I think he must have had some computational program before they were more widely available. You could put 256,000 word endings, suffixes, infixes, prefixes, whatever, on the verb to go. And so he suggested, as a result of that, there's the emphasis upon action, process, movement, motion, visually, sonically, in all kinds of other respects, could be associated with weaving designs as well. And he produced, I think, quite a beautiful analysis of the relationship between static and active spaces that, again, goes back to my initial falling in love with that eye dazzler design, which is full of vitality and vigor and movement. It's never still. It's always, fooling your eyes. So although it's a completely different language, that sort of perspective, I think, is shared with Hopi too. Hopi is a Uto-Aztecan language. Navajo is an Athabascan language. But the emphasis on process, movement, and so forth is present there as well. And that's sort of famously argued for by Benjamin Lee Whorf. So the example that I leave you with, there is a Hopi component of this exhibit, so I think this is justified, is I became especially interested in how personal names incorporate that aesthetic, that sort of phenomenal approach to the world, that phenomenology, as the philosophers would call it. And that's a name. This is a particular, there are many, many Hopi names, but this name, Kaitswisioma, literally means whiteness turning around in a line. Doesn't tell you what it refers to, but that's what the name picks out from the phenomenal world. What it in fact refers to is a kachina dance. And the white kilts, in this instance, the particular kachina also wears a white shirt. At a certain point of a line dance in a plaza, they all successively turn around in a line. And it's that image that is captured, that notion, that sense of motion and so forth, that I think speaks to that larger aesthetic. You can describe that in English, but I don't think somebody who only spoke English would use that concept to describe what they were looking at. And so I think that's one of the sort of the more profound things that I have learned through some of this work that I've been so lucky to do over the last, now I'm not going to tell you how many years, but thank you.
So we'll be hearing first today from Barbara Teller-Ornelas and Linda Teller-Peet, and they have been key collaborators and advisors for Shaped by the Loom since our first collections visit in 2018. Barbara Teller-Ornelas is a fifth-generation master Navajo weaver and culture bearer who sold her first rug when she was only 10 years old. Her father, Sam Teller, was a Diné trader for 32 years, and her mother, Ruth Teller, was a weaver, gardener, quilter, and photographer. When Ornelas was 10, her paternal grandmother dreamt that her granddaughter would become a great weaver who shared their traditions around the world. 56 years later, Ornelas has not only honed her artistry as a Two Grey Hills weaver, but shared it with audiences internationally in the form of workshops, lectures, and exhibitions. Linda Teller-Peet is an award-winning fifth-generation weaver who's best known for using a traditional Two Grey Hills regional style. Instilled in her work from the age of 6, when Peet was officially introduced to weaving, is the belief that beauty and harmony should be woven into every rug. Along with her weaving, she collaborates with art centers, guilds, museums, universities, and other venues to educate the public about Diné history and the preservation of Navajo weaving traditions. Together with her sister Barbara, she wrote Spider-Woman's Children, Navajo Weavers Today, the first book written about Diné weavers by Diné weavers since the time of Spanish and colonial contacts, as well as how to weave a Navajo rug and other lessons from Spider-Woman. Peet is also the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Textile Society of America.
Instead of referring to us as weavers, because 3 out of 4 of our clans are water-based, they call us the mermaids. So we're not very distinctive in our community. Because in our community, we have what we refer to as rock stars, because we have been exposed to some of the elder weavers that have come before us. People like Daisy Tuckelchee, who you probably have heard about. We've had Virginia Deal, Cora Curley, Julia Jumbo, Virginia Deal. These are all weavers that have really shaped the way that, and including our mother Ruth Teller and her sisters. And these people, these weavers, have really shaped our way of the weavers that we have become. And in our community, we weave Two Grey Hills styles, which is a regional style, and those formed after Bosco Redondo after 1868. And so after Bosco, about 270-ish numbers of trading posts went up. And a lot of those trading posts have exploited craftspeople, arts people, and but in the Two Grey Hill area where our father worked, we think we fared a better chance at achieving our goals. And one of the things that we learned when we were working at the store, helping out, is we would watch weavers come. And they would drive up in brand new pickups or brand new cars. And that was achievable by the sale of one rug or one tapestry. And it has been achieved again by our mother and our older sister Roseanne, and of course by Barbara. I haven't done it yet, but and
It's
we
coming.
thank you. We have an aunt that we have one remaining aunt. Her name is Mary Louise Gould, and we took a group of weavers to her house, and what she said to us was, like in the old days, she made when the casinos were coming in, she made a deal with one of the new casinos to weave this huge rug. And of course, after she wove it, they reneged on the deal. And they had given her a quarter of the agreed upon price. And so once the casino said, I'm sorry, we're not going to take your piece, she took it to Gallup to Richardson's and they bought it. She came home driving her brand new pickup, all fully paid.
Toyota Tundra.
Toyota. And she went back to the casino, gave them their quarter deposit, and went home. And that's how we roll in our community. And so we've journeyed a long way with our family. We now have 7 generations in our family. And Barbara's going to talk about how we learn how to weave from our mother.
Okay. I always say that we learned the prayers and the songs from our grandmother, especially our Nali, our paternal grandmother. And we learned the basics of weaving from our mom. She was always demonstrating at the Tugger Hill Trading Post, so she really didn't have that much time for us. So it was left to our grandmother. But we learned the techniques, the design from our older sister Roseanne. When our mom was a small child, her and her 2 sisters were weavers, and our grandmother, our maternal grandmother, used to take them to different houses, and they would finish pieces for people. So they really learned how to finish pieces, how to troubleshoot and stuff, and then and they taught us that. And then our older sister Roseanne mastered that, and so she was able to troubleshoot so much things on the weaving and which what she taught us. And so we come from a long line of weavers that are thinkers and that that they see things, and then we always say math comes easy for us because all we see in our work is math. So,
Yes. And so when we sit at our loom, we sit at the universe, because our looms and everything comprises of the sky bar, the earth bar. We have male and female. We have the lightning and the rain. Everything that we see every day is the universe, and that's how we learned. And so what we discovered is that not everybody is a weaver. When you're young and your whole household is full of looms and things, and when you go out in the world, you think everybody's a weaver. But that was not true. And so Barbara was the first one to actually break away from the regional styles. And it was really hard for our mother and our older sister and our aunts in the community, because we have always been pigeonholed to be regional weavers. And so when Barbara got out on her own and moved to Phoenix, Arizona, she realized that she needed to branch out. And so when she came home, our community created an intervention. And so they said, you can't do that. You're a Two Gray Hills weaver. And she said, no, I'm a weaver, and I need to try the weaving feeds my family. And so she was getting exposed to a lot of things, and I'm going to have her talk about the Herd Museum. Yes.
So probably like in 1980, around 79, 80, I kept going to galleries in Scottsdale, hoping that they would buy my pieces. And they kept shutting the doors on me. They were like, we don't deal with weavers. And kept saying, but I'm an artist, but they didn't see me that way. They only saw me as a weaver, you know. And then they would tell me, take your weaving back to the reservation. If it's on the truck, we'll buy it, right? So they had no concept of cutting out the middleman. And they refused to open the door for me to get into the gallery, to even look at things, you know. And then I kept going home with my weavings, and my dad says, "Why are you doing this? You know, you should. There's galleries over there that we sell to." And I said, "They won't open the doors for me." And so my dad says, "I know this guy who's opening up a gallery in Scottsdale. Go see him. Tell him who your dad is." So I went to go see Joe Tanner, and I told him, you know, who my dad was, and he finally opened the door for me. And then he goes, "I can't buy one of your pieces, but you can put it on consignment." And he goes, "And I only need to consign it for 2 weeks. And if it doesn't sell, you need to come back and pick it up, you know, because I guess he's breaking a rule somewhere." So I did that. I put my 2 pieces on consignment, and then 2 days later, he called me. He said, "Come pick up your checks." I sold both pieces. So we did that a few times, and then he goes, "You're too good for galleries." He goes, "You trading poses and gallery is not your thing." He goes, "You need to go down to the Herd Museum, and the Herd Museum's having their art show, and you need to ask for a table and see if they'll give it to you." You know, so I went down to the Herd and I said, "I want a table." And they said, "You can't do that. You know, these people paid their booth fees like months and months ago." But, you know, because I was a weaver and they had very few weavers in the show, they let me in, and I was able to sell. And it was the very first time I ever sold a piece straight to a collector. You know, I didn't have to share my earned money with anybody, you know, and that was really satisfying, you know. And then from there, they kind of the Herd Museum took me under their wings, and they told me that always be ready, you know, and always have a rug on the loom, because we will be calling. And they were, you know, they would call me at 10 o'clock and say, "You need to be here at 11. We have donors coming in," you know. So I would drive down there, and then I would tell them, "I have kids," and they go, "Dress them up and bring them." So I would put my son in a cradle board and then take him down there, you know, and my daughter dressed up. And so I raised my children at the Herd Museum. They crawled they both learned how to walk in the museum, and all the security guards knew who they were and took care of them. And they had a huge staircase that used to go up to the second floor, and my son would start crawling up these staircases, and then all these tourists would say, "There's a baby crawling up the staircase," and the security guards just pick him up and put him back on the floor. So that's where I came from, and they really taught me how to be a professional artist, you know. And it was the first time they pinned that title on me. It was artist, and from there, you know, and a whole new door opened up for me. And they were also recommended me to go to London to do an artist residency there at the Museum of Mankind at the British Museum. And because of them, I also entered Santa Fe Indian Market. And, you know, and just through their guidance, this is where I am.
So we've come a long ways from there. Barbara and my older sister Roseanne were I consider them trailblazers in our family, because they've really kicked down doors, and literally kicked down doors. And I'm the last one in the family, and I had a much easier time. However, when I was in high school, and my decision to go to college was thwarted a couple of times by counselors. And I went to a high school that had less than 10% of Native students, and they wouldn't sign us up to take the ACT to get into college. And they signed us all up to take these vocational battery tests, thinking that we were going to, you know, that we should go to vocational schools. And so my parents drove me to a different city to take the ACT. And I got into college, and my mother wove to put me through. And so when I got my degree, I came out and I made this big announcement to my family, and I said, I'm going to get a job now. I'm not going to weave anymore because marketing is too hard and I don't like the selling part, and all that stuff. And then I toiled away at a desk for about 20 some odd years. And, later, I think the last year I was ordering office furniture, and I thought, this is crazy. I need to get out. And by that time, Barbara had become a teacher with my mom, and she needed a little bit more help. And so
I had to fire my mom.
our mom was very, very polite. And so whenever she saw someone making a mistake, she didn't want to go over and correct anyone. And so she would just tell Barbara, that person needs help. And so finally, Barbara said, I need somebody to really go in and, tackle these problems. And so she asked me to participate. And I said, I've been away from weaving so long. I'm barely reteaching myself. I have a loom that's been in my closet for a lot of years. And she said, well, you need to get back into it. And what really happened then is that our older sister Roseanne passed away. And she passed away with with her son and her grandson, and due to an impaired driver. And that set a new tone with our family because we went into this really deep, dark place. And our mother finally called us home and said, you guys need to weave. And so she gave us our sister's weaving tools, and we grieved through the whole probably a few more years, and then we got right back into it. And right after that, I actually went back and I thought about her boys that were left over, that were survivors, and I said, who's going to teach their kids? Who's going to teach their grandchildren? And that's a responsibility that we needed to uphold. And so we went in with a new determination. And at the time, we were kind of dabbling in weaving classes just to teach our collectors how the process was being made. We weren't exactly teaching non-natives how to be Navajo weavers. It was just to give them an appreciation of what we do. So I began taking notes. And also a person entered our lives, which is my husband, Belvin Pete, who's also from another weaving family, and he was a mechanical engineer. And so he developed new looms. Our father had stopped making tools at that point because of his age and his health. And so Belvin started really coming up with new techniques for us. And that was wonderful because we were able to have collapsible looms that we started traveling with. We started doing more work with other scholars, and Barbara met up with Linda Ligon, who was at the time the head of Thrum's Books in Peru, of all places. And one thing that Barbara probably didn't mention is that under the Obama administration, she was the official Navajo cultural ambassador. So she was sent around the world. She went to Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and literally flew around the world like in 2 weeks. And I started traveling with her, and we were doing classes in Canada, in Toronto. And when they say you see Navajos everywhere, that is true, because our first day of class in Toronto, a Navajo came in and we went, whoa, that is weird. But the Diné tribe up there really wanted for us to teach some of the Diné people how to weave. And we consider that a great honor to be called upon for that. And we have also made new partnerships with the Her to teach only Navajo people. And we do that. We're on year 6 on that mission.
We have another class in May for all you Navajos here.
And so, we went back to our roots. with all the traveling that we do, with all the things that we started doing, the books and everything, we went back to our roots, back to Tugre Hills, and we started looking at the younger weavers there, and we want to champion those. And so we picked a few to be in our book. And as last week, I sent a whole box of roving to a young weaver that had lost her source of wool from when her aunt died. And so we have that same situation too, because our last remaining aunt has let go of her flock. So we're trying to find new ways to secure wool. We do our own processing. We've lately gone into learning how to dye, but from dye extracts, because we both live in the city and you can't pick plants on the interstate. So, and so one of the things when the Herd Museum came calling, we decided that even though we did not grow up with dyeing in our family, we wanted to teach the Navajo weavers what we knew and what we were learning. And so we're all learning together, and we've been able to shape their families as well. And when we work with the Idlewild School of Arts in Idlewild, California, we have taught there for 24 years. And they offer Navajo scholarships. And we have been very involved in choosing the people that come for scholarships. And we say, we want 2 members in a family, not just one person to come to our class, because if we can teach 2 members in a family, they can motivate each other and inspire each other to keep on weaving. And one of our prize students is Velma Craig. She came into our class about 11 years ago. And when she introduced herself, she said, I want to be a weaver. I want to teach my other kids how to weave. I want to work in a museum. I want to take care of rugs. And guess where she is today? She's an assistant curator at the Herd Museum, taking care of Navajo textiles. Her kids know how to weave, and she's teaching. And so we have a lot of mentees that we have carried with us, and we are very proud of that we are shaping their families as well. And we also, with our weaving classes, we started out with the 1 page, and after 20 some odd years, we were almost up to 30 pages of instructions. And so when Linda Ligon asked us for our next book, we said we want to do a how-to book. And so we achieved that in the year of COVID. That was really awful because, we had nowhere to promote it, and it just came about that way. But we're pretty proud of what we have created, and we know that there's a lot of Navajo weaving books out there, and a lot of them were written, I think, just by observation, because the language is hard. And just like Mr. Whitley said, that the language is very verb oriented. And so it's difficult for a lot of people to understand that. And I am in my 2nd year of being a loose Indigenous Scholar Fellowship. And so one of my projects is to turn our how-to book, the middle book there, into a written Navajo language book. And we also want to do a spoken word, so that when we do our all Navajo classes, we want to immerse the language with the weaving. We have so many Navajo students that come to us that have lost linkages with their weaving, that have lost linkages with their language, and we want to be there to help in those situations. And so we also are very proud that our first book, the Navajo, Spider Woman's children's book, was a project that was very dear to us, because we were able to travel from the extreme north to the extreme south, the extreme west, extreme east of the Navajo Nation to visit these weavers. And it was phenomenal to be in their homes and talk to them. If they wanted to speak Navajo, we spoke Navajo. If they wanted to speak English, we spoke English. But we wanted to capture every word that they did, that they said to us, because in a lot of the books that have come before us, their voices aren't really included. And so we wanted to make sure that we honored the elder weavers, and we also focused on male weavers. We focused on young weavers. We want to show everyone that weaving is continuing. It's in all of our lives, and it has shaped us from beginning to end. And we honor the songs that have come with it. We have honored the prayers that come with it. Our whole life is about weaving. And even in our trip here, we have our loom set up in our room. And it's not a day that goes by that we don't sit at our looms. And it's been one of our biggest blessings to be able to do this.
One thing I can say about our weaving or our friendship is, if we get upset with each other and we don't want to talk about it, we always start talking about weaving. And that seemed to put us back together.
That's true. And, you know, I live in Colorado and she lives in Arizona, in Tucson, Arizona. I live in Denver. And so for a lot of years, when we would do, when we were working on our pieces, I would make a mistake or something and I would drive home. And back then when my sister was alive, I would put my loom in the kitchen and then I would go to bed because it's about a 9-hour drive. And in the morning I would wake up and I would go in and my loom would be fixed. And I would sit there and go, oh, the wool fairies have been here. And so after Barbara invited me to teach classes with her, I started becoming my own wool fairy. And but it's been such a journey for us. And we have a lot of weavers that we are responsible for, and we are continuing to do projects, and we're looking forward to a lot more as we journey on.
Thank you both. I am pleased to introduce Wade Campbell next. He's been a friend and colleague for some years now, so I'm glad to finally have him here in New York. Dr. Campbell is a Diné historical archaeologist whose research examines the relationships between Diné communities and other local groups in the U.S. Southwest from the 17th century to the present day, including the Pueblos, Spanish, and Americans. Campbell is engaged with a range of questions related to longer-term patterns of Navajo settlement and economic activity across the greater Four Corners region, with a particular focus on incipient Indigenous pastoralism and related shifts in land use, social organization, and diet and subsistence practices.
All right. Okay. Well, ja, det är benämnt då Diné, Wade Campbell initial, kia ani nishle, beligana bushes chin, tro hundred dash child, beligana dash nelle, kitili dant nasha, ado akut ego dina hastin nishle. For all the rest of you that are looking at me like, what in the world did you say? My name is Wade Campbell. I am a Navajo archaeologist and assistant professor of anthropology at Boston University, and originally from with roots in the area known as Black Mesa. And today I'm going to talk not so much about my research, but in the ways I see my research articulating with sort of the goals of the symposium and the exhibit, in particular, how an archaeological lens, indigenous archaeology lens, can help us to start to tease apart some of these themes that we've been hearing about today. I often joke that I have a bad case of Navajo man syndrome, which is if you give me a microphone and the chance to be in front of people, I might run over time and just keep talking. So we got notes, we're set, and I'll try to rein that in. To give you a sense of what I'm going to talk about today, this does not work. Sort of short outline, but I'm basically just going to run through what is indigenous archaeology, talk, at least from my point of view, about how I see weaving and sheep herding folding into Navajo society over a period of several centuries. And then as an archaeologist, as an anthropologist, where I see these things kind of interacting with larger processes, to riff off of Peter Whiteley's introduction, right? That if the Navajo language is concerned more about process than things, I'm really interested in that too, except I try to use the things to look at the processes. So that'll carry us through. I'm not going to assume that most of you actually know where the Navajo Nation is. I saw a map in the exhibit where it showed the reservation actually kind of smaller. This is what it looks like, the full sort of outline of the reservation in red. And I'm going to reference a few areas through this, in particular Black Mesa, where my family's community, Kitsaili, is located. I'm also going to talk and reference later on sort of Spanish colonial New Mexico, which is the Rio Grande River Valley and not much more. And then the Navajo reservation today is only one small part of the larger area in which Navajo people have historically interacted over the past 1,000 years. And so, there are stories and there are connections to all these areas kind of around the reservation and in that big hole on the left, which is the Hopi Reservation. One of the areas, though, that is of particular interest and that I'm going to touch on in more detail is this area that's known as Diné, which is among the Navajos. It's regarded as both, by archaeologists, it's been constructed as this sort of homeland, but it is a very special place to Navajo people as well, where it is the center of sort of Navajo people coming into being. And it happens to be a place where you find the oldest known Navajo archaeological sites. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. What is indigenous archaeology and why should you care about it? The first thing what I'd like to do is simply define archaeology, right? I am not an architect. I get that a lot. I don't deal with dinosaur bones, and I don't fight Nazis, which wasn't a thing until the past 8 years when it was like, oh, this is potentially a thing. But archaeology, to riff on this whole process things kind of metaphor we got going on, is the systematic study of the human past using material remains. And an indigenous archaeology is that process done in a manner that centers Native peoples as with, for, and by. Why is this interesting? Why should you care about it? Because, well, for the past century of American archaeology as a whole, this hasn't been the case. People parachute in, they dig up some stuff, they take it back, they fill the building that's down on whatever that is, 80th Street or whatever. And so indigenous archaeology science developed more increasingly since late 70s, early 80s. This idea of with, for, and by is at the core, and it's sort of deceptively simple, but I wanted to unpack a few things in terms of that definition. One, what is with, for, and by? It's a focus on centering the work of Native people as researchers, as active participants in all stages of archaeological research. But it's not necessarily limited to just natives. You can be an indigenous archaeologist and be a non-native collaborator that truly engages in your research in the spirit of, true collaboration, right? Where you incorporate people throughout all stages of your research. This idea of sort of indigenous methodologies, what is that? Well, it's taking an approach that is tailored to the community at hand. Indigenous is a catch-all. It's a big kind of umbrella term. And within that, right, I could have arguably said, right, I am a proponent, practitioner of a particular Diné form of indigenous archaeology. And in that, it is thinking of research, archaeological research, in a way that is in dialogue with Navajo teachings, Navajo ideas, Navajo goals and wants, some of which include the fact that I haven't actually excavated anything in many, many years. And that's in part due to teachings that I had throughout my family, family members, medicine men, other folks, where excavation is held to be something that's truly of last resort. And so I do my work without, it's probably surprisingly for most of you, an archaeologist that doesn't put holes in the ground. I focus on landscape questions, archaeological survey, identifying sites and looking at the relationship between humans, the environment, and each other. You could have this take other forms for other tribes, but at least in this case, right, I think the benefit, though, is that it pushes you to kind of innovate. If you say you can't dig, well, then how do I get the information that I need to answer the questions I'm interested in? And it can lead in some really interesting ways. Geophysics, different types of survey methods, different types of sampling methods. 21st century is a kind of great new world, and it lends itself to things that aren't simply putting a massive hole in the middle of a ruin. And this last bit is sort of, it's often held up as a sort of decolonizing research model, insofar as that it allows tribes now as directors of research programs, as participants in research programs beyond simply being the hired excavators, to actually develop work that pursues questions that we're interested in and potentially has the power to challenge traditional narratives, and not traditional in the native sense, but traditional in anthropology has created this narrative and we're the experts and this is true. The truth of the matter is it's our history, and our ability to tell it, to take control over that writing of history, is something that is central to this indigenous archaeology approach. All right, so with that said, what does this mean in terms of Diné weaving? Like I said, history is power, or it's all about power. It's about sort of writing these accounts and constructing narratives that people recognize and engage with and continue further down the way. And I think archaeology is interesting to think about in terms of Diné history and weaving and sheep herding, in part because it brings a unique material lens on the past that very few other disciplines do. Historians are really confined to texts, and the truth of the matter with that is that, brown, black people weren't necessarily writing about themselves in a way that people recognize as a source of data that you can engage with through a traditional historical framework. And ethnography, right, is focused more, it allows you to do some of this, but it's focused in a more kind of contemporary moment. And so archaeology, I think, is a really interesting counterpoint to these types of research strategies, in that it gives us a really kind of tangible way to engage with history, the production, the act, and start to explore these wider processes about, societal importance or, economic activities, cultural importance, etc. And, and I think rugs are a great example because they're kind of omnipresent. When people think about Navajos, they think about, turquoise, jewelry, they think about rugs. This is a rug that's hanging in my living room and that I've had since I was a kid, right? Like they're everywhere and people collect them and they're held to be really kind of important things. And so I actually want to use that as a kind of case study of what I'm talking about, right? If we talk about rugs and weavers and use a sort of indigenous archaeology lens to approach this, what are we getting out of it? Well, the first thing is, right, like these are iconic images, the sort of sepia tint glimpse of the past, and people are weaving. There's some freshly shorn sheep up there, massive, massive looms. They're selling these, as we've heard, right, to trading posts, and, the ones that aren't run by Navajo traders, usually a bunch of Mormons that are, in these sort of clans operating throughout the edges of the reservation. They're buying rugs in bulk and they're selling them on. And they're selling them on to the point that, you're right, famously, Antiques Roadshow goes through in, 2001 or something, it's like $350K, $500,000. I looked it up yesterday, and the appraisal value, according to Antiques Roadshow's website now, is 1.5 to 2 million for this rug, right, with this history of Kit Carson and whatever. But it's fascinating when you think about it in terms of, okay, all these rugs are being produced, they're being put out there, they're being sought after. people were disenfranchised. Well, not disenfranchised, but people were underpaid. They were taken advantage of. And you get a lot of cases like this, even in the exhibit here. This is just an example pulled off of, this Museum of the American Indians website, right? But if you look through all the information, what is not present is the maker. Artist unknown, artist, once known, these sorts of things, So there's a whole museum in Farmington, New Mexico. It's the Museum of Navajo Art, and it's all rugs. And pretty much almost every single one that's hanging on the wall, their little placard says, artist unknown. This one here at the NMAI, who's, the donor's known, some lady that, gave this over and bought it back in the 30s. But we don't actually know anything about who made it. And this is, I think, a great example of how archaeology can intervene, because by taking a focus on the materials, we can start to approach these other larger processes, systems that underlie the production and trade of these objects. And so, as a case study, I want to highlight the work of another Navajo archaeologist, Rashenda Lee, who is an archaeologist. She's also a weaver. And over the past several years, she's conducted an ethnographic and materials-based study of what we in archaeology call technological style in Navajo weaving. And that's essentially the idea that the way we make things reflects a set of processes that we've learned. We classically use it to think about pottery production, right? Do you coil build it? Do you smooth? Do you do this? At what temperature do you fire? And do you do that because that's who taught you? And the next person, over is making a pot, but is, using a paddle and anvil technique or something. And you fire it and they come out looking the same. But the object histories, the technological styles employed to make two very similar things are different. And they reflect the the learning history of the creator. Rashenda's work is awesome, I think, because she applied this, tried and true ceramics-based thing to Navajo rugs. In particular, she examined a host of technical attributes inherent in making tapestries, namely, thread and cord, spin and ply direction, finishing techniques. You can sort of see some of those things here on the upper right. And as she ended up examining, I think, 35 different rugs in the collections of 6 weaving families throughout Eastern Navajo, including, I believe, you, right? Yeah. And, what her findings were that if you take these sets of data and you analyze them really kind of microscopically and pay close attention to the actual material itself, you can see the hand of the individual weaver, and you can get a sense of the different lineages, the family groups, but also when other people intervene, right? So this example on the right, she provides as one of the sort of famed Yei rugs by Hustine, and how he was supposed to have done all the weaving himself, but she was able to point that you actually can see a transition between one weaving style and another, suggesting that you can actually see the work of somebody who started it and then somebody who's finished the rug, people collaborating. And the story is told in the rug itself. I think this is really cool. And I think it's a great example of what archaeology can tell you, because this is kind of tantalizingly an opening to giving a voice back to these otherwise creatorless rugs that are rolled up in all these, storerooms across the East Coast and elsewhere. Maybe not the individual person, but their families, which I think is, just as important. Now, I think it's a great example, but I have to say that I am not that big into rugs beyond the connoisseur of like, it's very beautiful. I appreciate the work that goes into it. I'm much more interested in the wider process that underlies it, namely herding, and this practice that has been the bedrock of Navajo life for centuries. And this is more along the lines of what my research gets into. But what I want to highlight is that, herding was and is actually still a really key part of Navajo life today. It's still, herding animals or sort of ranching is one of the main economic practices on the reservation. It allows families to make livelihoods. People still shear in when you step back and realize that all this wool, as you guys mentioned, right, you've lost access to your family's flock. So where are you getting wool? There's all these other larger sort of systemic questions that come out of a single rug. And I think that's fascinating, right? The rug introduces us to the sheep, which introduces us to questions of herding, of wool cutting and sales, and the influence of U.S. government subsidies for wool buying throughout the 20th century. Sheep are a key part of Navajo cuisine, and it's inescapable, I think. And so, if you sort of recenter it from the rug and use the rug as a window into this larger system of practices, one of the things that becomes readily apparent is that sort of Navajo land as a whole is what I call a pastoral landscape, right? The places where our families live, because of this long, deep relationship between us and our animals, has created situations where the typical Navajo family camp is oriented around corrals, is oriented around sheep herds, and you can see this is my family's camp up on Black Mesa, and you can see there's a horse corral, there's a big old sheep corral over there with the little rice grains, are a herd of 250 sheep tucked into that little corral. And so if we realize that, at least as an archaeologist, this is fascinating because while I can't necessarily identify a rug, I can identify these as sites. In particular, corrals emerge as the key kind of areas that directly attest to the activity of keeping and managing a flock of animals. And they persist, right? Sheep, it poops, it pees, it builds up, it affects the landscape, it persists. And so you can actually see the corral, not necessarily because in this case there's a wall or a fence, but because the vegetation density is a little different, and you can make out just to the right some of the old fence line. There's the hogan, the house, as well as a shade house, a kind of work area. And this is a classic summer camp. On the right is one of my family's winter camps. So we call it Benda Uche, which is, so it's the lambing camp. And you can actually see this in the corral itself. There's dozens of little pens built into the wall of this very large corral that was shared during the winter by multiple members of our extended family. So there's 4 hogans surrounding this. People are coming together to manage herds during the winter. And I think this is fascinating, and you can start to see, by identifying these sites on the landscape, you can start to discuss the larger mechanics of herding practice. The summer rotation, the winter lambing, questions of shearing and sales and the like. And if you scale this up one more step and start to actually catalog these sorts of sites across a family's grazing area, across their particular sort of herding landscape, you can start to approximate larger suites of activity and movement over longer and longer periods of time. And so what this shows here is for my family, the historic shifts in herding practice, herding strategy over the course of basically the 20th century, from today all the way back to sort of this kind of hazy period, sort of post-Long Walk, pre-1900. And what you can see here, at least in our case, is, through oral histories and through other accounts, we've been able to, we're related by clan to folks in Chilchimbato down in the sort of Kayenta Valley area. And those clan connections were leveraged by my great-grandfather, my grandfather, to move animals seasonally off the mountain down into the valleys and then back, right? And then they would move through these areas, and it was a very fluid kind of practice. Some of you might be familiar with, the Son of Old Man Hat, which describes these epic movements across, the central part of Navajo land. And this is very much in that vein. But what happens is basically around 1940, the Taylor Grazing Act is put in, and there's grazing boundaries that are put into place. And so in this case, the Mesa Rim becomes the defining boundary between what we call Unit 4 and then the other one, which is Kayenta, which I think is 8. And so that means now that families can no longer do these big movements and instead have to shift their practices. And so you still see a high degree of mobility, with people moving between winter and summer camps. But they're not constrained here. They're leveraging the clan relationships, ideas of to go and herd in other areas, but they're moving around a smaller area. And then what I sort of have described here as phase 3, this interesting process unfolds starting in about the 70s, is that Navajo families, at least in our area, are being folded into the Western system more thoroughly. People are going to school. People are taking wage jobs. It's viewed as something positive, but the impact is that the herding strategy shifts again. No longer do you have sort of the roaming within this larger area, but then you have, different families with adjacent grazing areas kind of being more constrained. And that sort of persists into the present day. And now what you have is decreasing herd size. The folks that still are generally herding are often older. And herding shifts again. It's no longer bigger movements. It's no longer older folks and little kids like it was from, the 70s until, say, 90s, early 2000s. But it's often older folks singly managing a herd and no longer utilizing multiple camps and corrals, but often doing kind of a home-based strategy, where you can sort of see this here. And this is actually from some of the field work I did with my aunt back in 2018, where the lines actually represent basically individual days over the course of 6 months. So you can actually sort of see where we went, right? But the point here is that we're just using the one corral, and we're not doing these larger kind of sweeping movements. Now, what I think is really interesting is that, these are tied to historic trends. As I was saying, right, the shifts in herding practice can be tied to specific moments in Navajo history throughout the 20th century, particular activities, the like. What I am really curious about is actually if there are regional differences. And so these maps, I did some internet stalking and bio reading and figured out some folks I already knew, other folks I wasn't too sure about, like Four Corners region. I was like, I'm just going to say it's Tucson. I don't know. But I'd be really curious, for all of you to actually learn what your families, what this looks like for all of you, right? Because, when you start reading the literature on Navajo pastoralism, there's a lot of sort of enshrined kind of knowledge from the 40s that talk about herding patterns from one part of the reservation. And then you find an article from 10 years later from another part of the reservation, and it's completely different. People are going summer high, winter low, and then they're going winter high, summer low. Stuff is they're moving animals between elevations, but at different times of the year. And so I'm really fascinated by this, and maybe we can talk about this later, but what is this case for you guys? If you talk to your family members and really kind of asking, well, what were they doing? What was, great, grandfather doing back then? It'd be really, I think, fascinating to see, because I suspect you would start to see different timings and different timings reflecting different engagement with other sort of, maybe the Farmington influence is different from the railroad influence in the Gallup area versus, the Mormon and Hopi influence out on the Western res, just sort of imagining possibilities. But one of the other things that kind of comes out of this is that in doing this work, it became readily apparent that, if you actually try to sketch out roughly a history of Navajo sheep herding, you quickly learn that basically everything that is written is basically 1860 forward, right? So when people talk about, we did a history of Navajo sheep herding, they're talking about a history of Navajo sheep herding under the American period, because that's when you actually have Navajos being subsumed into a colonial system that's writing a lot about them and taking statistics and that sort of thing. And what emerges instead is this blue area. That's what I'm really curious about, is this earlier period. How, as Hadley said, I'm interested in incipient herding. Like, how do you go from, if you accept this traditional definition that Western herd animals are introduced by the Spanish, 1600, right, into New Mexico, how do you go from never having herded deer or whatever, or rabbits or something, to actively managing herds of animals and starting to take their, woolly hair and weave it into things? Like, what is the knowledge process that lets you start to do this? And I think it's a really kind of fascinating thing, because as I sketched out at the beginning, there's also questions of, regional relationships, questions of changing food ways, and these sorts of things. And so what we'll run through in the last part is this: what is early Navajo herding? In particular, when I say early Navajo, it's a sort of archaeological term of art, right? But it's basically pre-American period, so pre-1860s. And the work that's been done on early Navajo herding, early Navajo culture, society has been generally focused in the Diné area. And it's interesting because, as I was saying, Spanish influence didn't really extend very far past the Rio Grande River Valley and the missionized Pueblo communities. So this question of adoption and learning is taking place under a situation where, as a sort of anthropologist, I would say a peri-colonial situation, but people are not controlled. Navajo people are not controlled in the same way that Pueblo people are. And that creates a different dynamic governing the adoption of animals and the learning how to take care of them, and how then this growth of a Navajo herding tradition comes into being. And, how do you distinguish early Navajo stuff on the ground? You have classically hogans, like we do today. People are farming. There's distinctive pottery types from these early periods. And one of the other kind of key elements is that there are hundreds of these fortresses that early archaeologists called pueblitos, like little pueblos. But they're defensive structures all throughout Diné and parts of the res. And in that, we know that people are herding. You can find material evidence. This is the distal humerus of a sheep that has a butcher mark on it. Because if you think about butchering, right, once you take the skin off right here, you often cut it across the base of the humerus to get it off. And you can actually see one of the marks there. And at some of these pueblito fortresses and other places, there are stone enclosures that have always sort of been suggested to be corrals. But the sort of role of herding in early Navajo society and the extent of it, the intensity of it, is a question that remains to be answered. And this is actually where I focus most of my research personally. But we'll put that aside for a second and say, okay, you have early Navajo society, focus in Diné and other parts of the Four Corners. What about weaving? I know you guys came here for the weaving. And the truth of the matter is, it's unclear. We have some textual accounts from the Spanish that are reporting on raids done over like a 40-year period, and they get hauled before the Inquisition, and they testify that Navajos are doing a bunch of things, including weaving wool and cloth. But there's not much else that we know. And so I think in this case, archaeology has something really unique to offer. Namely, over the past century of people investigating early Navajo sites, particularly in the Diné area, there have been caches of what people have assumed to be weaving tools recovered from these areas around these little defensive sites. And some of the connections are arguably sort of obvious, but others are less so, and you'll see why in a sec. And so I figured who better to clarify this than expert weavers, and perhaps more expert weavers, or just knowledgeable amateur types like myself. So the first example is from this pueblito, which is called Split Rock for obvious reasons. Interestingly, that little shadowed outcrop on the left, it has a 6-inch thick mat of sheep dung under it. So people, but it's up on a mesa edge, so people are apparently getting animals up there and keeping them there. But it's a hike to get up into that. Anyhow, so the weaving cache from Split Rock consists of these objects here, what they call 4 sort of modified wooden tools. In and of itself, right, so that's, I think, 20 centimeters, that's 12 inches, a foot, basically. And you can see that the ends of some of them are modified and worked. They describe them as one having a chisel edge and the other having a kind of pyramidal 4-sided edge, right? It's been kind of tweaked. The other part of this cache includes these, which are assumed to be spindle whorls. One that's been, made, and the other that's a backup or something. The interesting thing is, right, is that they're not that big. If you look at the scale, they're essentially the size of my palm. And interestingly, if you play with these in false color images, you can actually see on this, there's a black spiral that jumps out a little better. So when you're spinning it, there would have been a little design that you could sort of see as you're doing this. So this is from Split Rock. There's another example from one of the biggest pueblitos as well, known as Francis Mesa Pueblito. And again, you have a broken, presumably spindle whorl, about the same size, actually a little bigger, as well as, kind of fascinatingly, a cache of worked sticks. And of them, I think there's, what does that say, 76, I think? 46. So of these 46, they identified 2 right away as likely weaving related, in part because their ends are shaped, and along this meter long stick, which isn't that thick, it's only like as thick as your kind of pinky, there are all these what they described as incisions, but I think it might be something different, and other folks are nodding, so we'll see. Like, this is fascinating. And at in the same area as this, there's also references to when they excavated this site in the like 1912. They took out all the dirt, and they noted that the floor had, these are examples sent by a friend of mine, Ben Bellarado, who's an archaeologist that studies weaving of sandals. These are examples from Anasazi sites in the Bears Ears area that show very clearly what this describes at this Navajo Pueblito, which are loom anchors in the floor that are set in. So presumably they're doing something along the lines here, up on the upper right? They're tying their looms into the buildings. And this is kind of fascinating because this is held to be the example of the sort of traditional Navajo loom, but there's all sorts of reasons why these aren't necessarily being found and these are. And so to wrap up, I think this is actually a really fascinating case for taking or thinking about how an indigenous archaeology lens can inform studies of Navajo weaving. In terms of weaving as its own activity, right, this is obvious evidence that Navajo folks are, surprise, surprise, weaving in sites that are dated to 1720, 1740. The question of the comment about the looms is a statement that you can set up an external loom outside under a tree, but you're not going to, if people move it or if it decays, you're not necessarily going to find it as readily as something that's like built into a better preserved, better protected structure. And I'm curious as to this last aspect, there's questions then I would think that you could potentially answer by studying these in greater detail, particularly, what are they using to weave? Are they using wool? Are they using cotton, which is the older southwestern material? Might the length of the sticks or the length of the spindle whorls kind of let you get at that? And what kind of things might they be weaving on a loom base that presumably has 4 anchors in it, so maybe something like that. Questions, right? And then also weaving as part of a larger pastoral system, suggests, right, that people are herding, which has been an uncertain question, as if you remember that graph. There's also indications that if people are herding, then they're also likely engaged in using all those other secondary things that come from animals. Classically dairy products, which in the Navajo world isn't super common today because of commodity cheese having this like hard grasp on our memories and like intestines. But if you talk to older Navajo people, people talk about drinking a lot of goat's milk and having goat and sheep milk cheese, and it's something that isn't really as common today, may have been much more common in the past. And interestingly, I think there's an argument that because of, if you think of herding in a larger historical framework as 2 parts of a normal curve, the modern day herding activities, small herd size, you can go, how do you say it, sheep to loom? Yeah. I think in some ways that is the current state of Navajo herding and weaving is probably a really good analog for the earliest moments of Navajo herding and weaving, and not what everybody reflects on, which is this high point of 1900 plus or minus a few decades when they had to do a livestock production supposedly because it was so detrimental, where you have millions of animals. So to wrap it all up, 15 seconds left. Again, archaeology's unique material lens on the past, I think, offers a lot to these larger discussions and kind of moves us from an object into discussions of larger processes, larger systems. I think this work, I hope, is in some way an example of how we can do this work from a material lens to start to more critically discuss Navajo history and the actions that Navajo people were undertaking themselves. And this last bit, right, the references to like, I want to tap your knowledge later and see like, what do you think they're weaving? I think we could actually do some of that, right? If you find these sorts of tools, what does that mean? They're described often as shed sticks or weaving implements, and that's it. And I don't necessarily think that's truly the case. So thank you all. Thanks to Hadley for the invitation. And all right, on the dot.
Thank you so much, Wade. We'll have a short break and gather again at 11:20. So our next presenter is Larissa Nez, who's an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation. She was born and raised in the Navajo Nation in a small community in northern Arizona. Larissa earned her BA in art history with a minor in sociology from the University of Notre Dame and her MA in public humanities from Brown University. She's currently a PhD student in ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research explores the intersections between art history, cultural studies, critical theory, Indigenous studies, and Black studies. Turn it over to you.
All right. Yeah, it's good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you all for your attendance today and for supporting this beautiful exhibition. I wanted to thank the curator of this exhibition, Hadley, whose exemplary knowledge and care is evident in this space and whose friendship and support has enabled many of us to be here today. Additionally, I wanted to extend my thanks to Bard Graduate Center and their staff, whose warm welcome, their efforts in coordinating the events for this exhibition and support is deeply meaningful and appreciated. I also wanted to acknowledge that as a guest on Lenape lands, I will respect their homelands, their people, and their ancestors to the best of my ability. As many of us here have begun, She'e Larissa Nez Yinashia, Hashkinishle, Ziklahni Bashtin, Tachini Edashiche do Totsani Edashinale, Vernon Nez Eshaje, do Laura Johnson Eshamat, Patricia Johnson Esha Masane, do Lawrence Johnson Eshache, Janet Nez Eshanella Assan, do Peter Nez Eshanella his team, its aunt. My name is Larissa Nez, and as Hadley had introduced me, I'm a UC Berkeley student. I'm also a Forge Project Fellow as well as a Vera Lee Center Fellow. I am of the Mud People clan and born for the Mountain Cove people. My maternal grandfather is of the Red Running into the Water people, and my paternal grandfather is of the Big Water people. I'm fortunate to have been able to grow up in the Diné homelands, surrounded by our sacred mountains, relatives, and people. Before I was born, my family prayed that I would walk on the sacred corn pollen path and would learn how to speak and listen to our D and Diné. Today, I'm here to share what I've learned through the act and practice of listening. Listening to our human relatives, to our ancestors, to our elders, our medicine people, and young ones. Listening to our non-human relatives, natural elements, animals, and plants who sometimes carry specific messages for specific people for specific reasons. And listening to our sacred beloved treasures, like the weavings in this exhibition, the items that bless my family's hogan, and cultural treasures that have been stolen from us, that have been waiting for hundreds of years to come home, but who have also been waiting for someone to listen to them. In 1991, one of my grandfathers, Alfred Yazzie, traveled to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois. A delegation of Native people, including 8 representatives from the Navajo Nation, traveled to the Field Museum to assist administrators in meeting federally imposed deadlines of returning cultural treasures to tribes after passing the passing of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also known as NAGPRA. My grandfather, who was a well-known medicine man and highly respected leader, was guided through the exhibition hall, where he pointed out treasures used in sacred ceremonies that should not have been displayed. Afterwards, he received a tour of the collections, where he identified more cultural treasures that were taken from graves or acquired illegally from Diné lands. He stated, "These treasures are the heartbeat of the Navajo Nation, and they have their origins there. It's not right that these bundles are locked up here. We need them for our ceremonies." Another fellow Navajo Nation delegate stated, "What really hurts and angers me the most is that all of those living beings, those old ones, suffering in museums because they don't belong there. They are lost between this world and the spirit world, and they can't go back to either one until we bring them home." I was blessed to have my grandfather in much of my early life and receive the purest form of love he had to offer: Diné knowledge, prayers, language, and songs. My presentation, "We Are Alive, Restoring Meaning and Life to Navajo Weavings," is inspired by my grandfather's legacy and deep knowledge for Diné culture, language, philosophy, and the ways that he used these tools to advocate for our people's rights and sovereignty. My joy and hope as a Diné woman is that our Diné philosophy will lead me down the corn pollen path so that I might pass down what teachings I know in the future. And my vision and dream as a Diné scholar is that Diné philosophy will lead us down the path to liberation and revolution. I have been lucky to meet elders and young people who are collectively resisting paradigms and knowledges of power in order to reclaim and reestablish their relationship to their culture, who protect sacred spaces and geographies, who are recovering and fostering modes of kinship and belonging, and who are concerned with memory across space and time as validating components of how we define our histories and who we are meant to be. As a first-year PhD student in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, a majority of my research is focused on the ways that Western institutions interpret and discuss histories of colonialism, race-making, slavery, and transnational diasporas through the lens of Indigenous critical theory and the Black radical tradition. In this sense, I'm concerned by the life of Diné treasures and how they are intimately bound to Diné knowledge systems, homelands, and people. And in doing this work, I have developed an interest in conducting collections and archival research that explores the ways that Diné people have engaged in strategies of refusal and possibility. Over the last 2 years, I've worked as a Diné textiles with Diné textiles as a curator, educator, and a scholar. Diné textiles autonomously contain and are imbued with multi-dimensional connections to sacred places, plants, animals, and spiritual beings. Distinctive protocols to care for these material and immaterial spectrums, which are unique to each item, are necessary to sustain them. Diné community members, as we have all heard today, are essential stakeholders and partners in formulating these protocols. According to the Association of American Indian Affairs, NAGPRA applies to human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and cultural patrimony. However, in the event that NAGPRA does not apply to the repatriation of items, what options do cultural and academic institutions give to Diné people to care for these weavings, to access them, to nurture them? I suggest that it is the responsibility of these institutions to establish a holistic definition of care that is determined and defined by Diné stakeholder communities. The ultimate goal of my work in these spaces and others like it is to critically think about how Diné are doing this work, caring for our weavings so that they are being nourished while they are away from Diné Pikeya. An important consideration of the limitations in reaching this point are issues of epistemic violence. Today, it's common to hear the phrase, Native people live in two worlds, either voiced by Native people themselves, by non-Native scholars imposing this position upon us. And in this first world, it's commonly defined as one in which Native people have full autonomy and rights to practice, live, and learn their cultural teachings, language, and life ways. In this other world, that of dominant culture, that of colonization, white supremacy, and capitalism, it attempts to silence us and remove us. Despite its arguable validity at one time or another, I am concerned that the phrase Native people live in two worlds has the power and capacity to invalidate Diné philosophy, worldviews, and history. I am interested in creating space for us today to have a critical engagement with Diné worldviews and philosophy so that we are productive and proactive and not reactive to the forces and structures of colonialism. I believe it's important for us to address this constraining idea in order for us to realize the extent of my claims that Navajo weavings are alive and that Navajo people are able to restore meaning and life to them. Explicit and implicit forms of epistemic violence transcend Diné social and cultural worlds. It impacts how we see ourselves and also how others see us, how they represent us, and how they discuss our futures. As a Diné woman, and as many other Diné people are here today can attest to, our existence is shaped by our creation stories that tell us who we are, how we came to be, and how we should navigate and care for this world. From the moment Diné people were created by changing women, we were gifted with the knowledge, prayers, stories, and songs that would protect us against the perils we face, but that would also bring beauty into our lives and into the world, and establish a line of communication between ourselves, the cosmos, and our holy people. These are the fundamental teachings that have come to make up our fundamental paradigm, which reflects the living natural order of all living beings, including the interaction between this world and the cosmos. Through Diné people engage in a process of developing a critical consciousness about who we are and who we want to be in the future. This philosophy and path reinforces that our thoughts, speech, and experiences, ultimately our ways of knowing and ways of being, ensure our livelihoods. Similarly, Diné philosophy is central to understanding Diné textiles and the relationship to our creation stories. In our Diné creation stories, Spider Woman helped create the loom and gave Diné the gift of weaving. In gifting Diné with weaving, she also helped them construct the loom and its tools, attributing very specific properties that aligned with nature and the universe to each element. We believe that the loom is a part of nature, a physical manifestation of the sky and earth coming together. The weaver's designs represent their thoughts, their life, their breath, and their spiritual connection to the holy people in the cosmos. Weaving is thus a practice that connects Diné to the celestial, spiritual, and physical worlds around them. As such, every loom, all of the tools, and the weaving itself have a life and spirit of their own that is activated by the weaver's actions, songs, and prayers. Diné creation stories teach Diné how to care for the weavings, and also this care fosters a deep, meaningful connection between the past, the present, and the future, while also subverting colonial ideologies that categorize and silo our existence as disconnected from the world around us, creating hierarchies of inequality that foster the destruction and exploitation of the natural world around us. A critical analysis of different academic fields such as anthropology, archaeology, and art history shows that non-Diné dominate scholarship on Diné weaving. Anthropologists and art historians have attempted to delineate the historic political economy of weaving throughout the 19th and earliest 20th century, specifically situating trading posts as the center and Diné weavers at the periphery. This historiography obscures the critical role that weaving plays in relation to cultural resiliency. Diné creation stories are crucial in understanding Diné weavings as creative processes grounded in culture, aesthetics, and hajjan. Non-Diné scholar Richard Howells makes a distinction that Diné weavings and culture permeate a space that is not relegated to historical time or mythical time, and that Diné people are connected to the vast past, present, and future. Although this is a worthy attempt at articulating Diné philosophy, Diné people are better equipped to offer more nuanced explanations. Through the lens of a more distinctive analysis of temporality is possible. Conceptualizing Diné weavings within this space, we can understand a restoration of harmony across time, space, and place that will ultimately heal and repair misinterpretations of Diné weavings and understandings of why our people continue to weave. Is a refusal of the idea that Diné are restricted to Western temporality and modernity. It is a refusal of the idea that we live in two worlds. It refuses the notion that Diné people are split in two, that we are not whole, that we are not balanced, and that we lack beauty or harmony in our life. As a narrative of imperious nostalgia, the idea that Native people live in two worlds all at once tells us that our lands, lifeways, languages, and traditions cannot be reclaimed, that we cannot and should not exist as people connected to those things, and that who we want to be will never be possible. Sa'anarabik Ehojan as a decolonial approach and methodology upholds the vitality of our culture and lifeways. It revitalizes our ongoing fight to protect our land and our water and rejects any revisionist narrative that states our cultural treasures, our deities, our ancestors, those old ones, are not alive but are merely commodities for sale or artifacts, satisfying the white capitalist gaze. This presentation seeks to center Diné knowledge through a deep analysis of our creation stories as they shape our understandings about weavings. I demonstrate that Navajo weaving practices are tied to these creation stories in profound ways. Contemporary scholarship, curatorial practices, and museum ethics that engage with the weavings must learn from our people in order to respect and care for these works. I do not wish for non-Diné to access Diné cultural knowledge. Instead, I ask that non-Diné acknowledge that our philosophies and ways of life are alive and thriving, just like our weavings. Diné scholars have the capacity and power to use this knowledge to overturn settler colonial dynamics of power and representation in these spaces. As Jody Bird states in her seminal work, The Transit of Empire, the aim is to theorize alternative methodologies to address the problems imperialism continues to create. I hope to do so on my own accord with ontologies and Navajo epistemologies. Jody Bird states, by placing Indigenous phenomenologies into conversation with critical theory, I hope to identify Indigenous transits and consider the possible alternative strategies for legibility. Today, I hope that I have engaged in a process of what Bird calls an inward and outward turn, where Indigenous critical theory emerges from the center of Indigenous epistemologies and then turned outward to engage Western philosophical, legal, and cultural traditions in order to build upon the allied tools available. Likewise, as Glenn Couthard argues in Redskins, White Masks, those struggling against colonialism must turn away from the colonial state and society and instead find their own decolonial practice and praxis for the source of their liberation. I hope that I have articulated a desire to form a different kind of conversation and understanding about Navajo weaving, and that we are emboldened to claim that Sa'anarabik Ehojan will restore healing and life to our weavings. I thank you all for inviting me to this panel today and to share my knowledge and to vocalize my understanding about Navajo weaving and decolonial methodologies and practice. Not just an artistic practice as well, but one that connects us to our land, people, stories, and Diné. Okay.
Our final presenter today is Raphael Begay. Raphael is a visual storyteller based in Window Rock, the capital of the Navajo Nation. Through photography and curatorial initiatives, he intends to culturally express and creatively advocate for understanding and teaching found in the Diné way of life. In 2017, he obtained his BFA in Art Studio with a minor in Arts Management and an undergraduate certificate in Museum Studies from the University of New Mexico. Named by Southwest Contemporary as one of 12 New Mexico artists to know in 2020, Begay is the recipient of the 2021-22 Goodman Aspiring Artist Fellowship. And I also have the privilege of co-curating a forthcoming exhibition with Raphael about Diné weaving and photography, which is opening at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe this summer, with many of the people you also have heard today. Raphael, I'll turn it over to you.
Yate. She Raphael Begay in a she, Hana Athi Nishle, Kitlichini Bashichin, Taban da Shiche, Ashin da Chanela, Sinischi E Chishike, Arose Hodsade Nasha. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you all for joining us today and sharing in stories. As mentioned, I identify as a visual storyteller, and I'm just going to share some photographs and imagery from my ongoing work. as well as images that have been exhibited throughout the exhibition as well. The title of my talk or my presentation is Visual Blessings, Photographs of Land, Light, and Love on the Navajo Nation. So to begin, as a visual storyteller, as Diné, I believe my practice is not necessarily a byproduct of my creativity or thought process, but is an extension of my identity, is an extension of my journey as an individual. With that in mind, my journey begins here in Sinischi or Hunters Point, Arizona. The photograph here is my backyard taken in 2016 when I returned home from University of New Mexico in Albuquerque and took up the opportunity to document and embrace the relationship I have to Dineta, or our homeland. Similarly, I have my roots as a black and white analog photographer for the school newspaper for my middle school. And this is the same location that I took my first image when I wanted to share something with my local community. And it is also the place that I returned to begin my work. In addition to returning and reconnecting with home, this image here is naval, referencing Navajo folklore and epistemology of after birth taking at least your parents taking your umbilical cord and burying it at a particular place. My mother tells a story that she buried mine in my late grandparents' sheep corral. I'm surprised I didn't turn out to be a cowboy because of that or something, but it is a space of that is sacred to me. It offers strength, inspiration, and guidance and direction. And it's a space I return to now and again as I continue to move forward. And it truly is a blessing to have this foundation, this sense of community and home be represented not only here on the East Coast, but throughout the world by way of the internet and a few exhibitions that I've had the privilege to participate in. This next image is called Origin. It is also in Hunters Point and is an image of my late grandparents' home that my grandfather built for my grandmother. My grandfather, who I'm named after, Rafael Tabaha, was a veteran, and he was warranted this home here. And it was taken at a time, or it was created at a time when we were mourning the loss of my late aunt, Arlene Tabaha, my grandmother's eldest daughter at the time. And it's one thing about my process within my work. I am not necessarily seeking out an image to create, document, or develop. I am approaching it in terms of a responsive approach. So I am going out into my surroundings and responding to what I am seeing, what I am feeling, what is being offered to me, what I hear, what I am learning. So while here gathering with the family, we were mourning, and I decided there was a lot of emotional energy, and I just want to remove myself from that and offer a point of reference to just reflect. And so, as one does, I went to the sheep corral by myself with my camera, and just started to think positively about the progression of life, the transition that we all make, and also the development and progressive nature of our lives. I turned back to go back to the home, and it started to sprinkle, and there came a rainbow. And if you were to follow the trajectory of the rainbow, it would land just in front of that brown truck, which is my mother's truck there. But where it would land would be my grandmother's room. And about a month later, she had passed due to her age and from grief, I assume. And I believe this was an omen of sorts. But I also believe it was a way to ground me in that, in reference to that transition made of beauty. This next image here, pictured in the exhibition, is entitled Sheep's Clothing. It's a detail of my late grandparents' flock. Recently, over fall, this past year, some stray res dogs got into the corral, and we lost our flock. And it's been about a few years since my grandmother's passed, and I believe she maybe have came back for it. I'm not sure, but again, in the idea and notion of transition and the acceptance of our livelihoods, the temporality of this present moment that we are having together, It references these things that we put on, that we wear, that we hold true to ourselves, and that we share with one another as we represent and share who we are with each other. But one thing that very much interests me within my work and what I'm documenting is the notion of sheep as this transformative magician of sorts within our culture. It's a source of material, sustenance, it's a source of learning, of relationships, but it's also something that's very particular and specific to the way that we live. I describe my work as a place between red dirt and blue skies, and we as individuals, as community, are the connection between the two. And of that connection, I speak to or like to document what I term as Indigenous aesthetics, aesthetics indigenous to place, indigenous to culture, and indigenous to the aesthetic itself. This particular image is entitled Hung to Dry. There's some sheep fat hanging on a clothesline. So normally when you're the young kid at butchering, they'll give it to you and you're supposed to stand outside and hold it in the sun, and as we're all growing up, values change. I enjoyed Wade's presentation in terms of how pastoralism has changed due to assimilation, civilization, and to know that we as children are growing up, there's not necessarily anyone there to hold it for us, to take on those teachings and learning, take on that learning. And it's fascinating to see how only on the reservation could you have such an interaction. I mean, we have individuals who live off the reservation who have memories of this, and it's truly a blessing to have been raised and grown in this way. So these are two images here. The image on the left is internal, which is the internal lining of a freshly butchered sheepskin. And it's very interesting to me to see how the wool fibers and the flesh of the sheep are mixing together. It's very reminiscent of aerial photography or topographic imagery. But I always enjoy sharing this image and I have a personal relationship with it because it seems very abstract, but it's obviously based in reality. I like to think that with respect to Hajon and balance, that I am sort of vibrating, or at least my work is vibrating between those two constructs by way of imagination and through language. The image here on the right is a mutton slab during a gathering at my grandmother's home. And it's interesting to me that the notion of gathering is not necessarily spoken about when it comes to Diné culture. It is very much communal in the sense of what we're able to do by way of textile production, herding, coming together and sharing stories. I'm interested in relationships and how does one document and represent that? Speaking of relationships, this image here on the left is called Res Dog. And it's an image just post-butchering outside my grandmother's home after she passed. Her home had been vacant for some time. And, through the grieving process, my family decided to just give it some space and stay away. And so it was sort of forgotten for some time. And within the community, or at least in the area that we live in, Hunters Point, there is although other houses and families that live in the area. There's a stray dog problem on the reservation, as I'm sure you can imagine and can see here. But I went out with my camera and decided to just document as I go about. And I went in the backyard and there was a res dog with the sheep head that we had left out. And instead of me being upset or trying to run and grab it, I just thought, obviously, it would probably need it more than I. And it was interesting to sort of acknowledge this. And I think there is this preconceived idea of what Diné or life on the reservation can be or what it is, as opposed to actually living there and relating to your surroundings. I'm thinking about ecological relationships, not only to animals, plants, the stars, the elements, but how do we necessarily acknowledge and hold that? I think there's a certain amount of responsibility in being a creative. There's a certain sense of stewardship that comes along with it that we have an opportunity to engage with. I mean, I'm speaking of empathy, I'm speaking of love, I'm speaking about these forms of memories that have really informed my perspective as an individual. The image on the right is thirst quenching, is taken in Navajo, New Mexico, just after a graduation party. If you're familiar with the area in Navajo, the nearest trash receptacle is probably Fort, if you know someone who's willing to take it, or Gallup. And so that's about maybe an hour and a half drive. And instead of, as I was there documenting the family event, instead of taking it, they decided to burn it. So normally, when a family member passes, they will, for my family's practices, they will normally burn their belongings and allow it to move forward. But the trash here, I was taking my camera back to our vehicle, and I just seen it. I mean, the reason why there's a refrigerator outside, I guess, is probably my eye goes to the fire first. They were cleaning out their grandmother's sheep camp, and so they took out this very vintage, retro, historic refrigerator out of the hogan, and were cleaning it out. And as I was taking things back to the vehicle, I stopped. And so that's the shot. There's something there that is happening and vibrating. There's tension there. There's some visual cues playing with one another, hot and cold. You can see the heat. You can feel the dryness from the light and how it's reflected. And I remember my friend Andrea's grandmother, this is like, Yaj, what are you doing? And like, I'm on the ground and with my camera. She's like, it's just trash. And I was like, no, it's art. And, and I'll show you. This next image is called XOXO, taken in Buffalo Springs. I think something that's very fascinating about living on the reservation is Indigenous imagination as revolution, as survivance, as a way of navigating and creating space. I think for a long time, growing up on the reservation, I didn't have a value that I have for it now. It took me some time to leave and to understand what it could offer, what I could learn. And I pride myself in not necessarily documenting individuals or human beings within my work because I want to acknowledge my stance, my presence as a photographer and what I am seeing, what I am documenting, and what I am sharing. And it invites the viewer also to occupy that space with me, to relate and to understand and to engage with this place in a way that is holistic, or at least one would hope so. And I've had the pleasure of being able to travel to different parts of the reservation, which I'll go into detail a little bit later. And similar to Wade's presentation, the notion of clan relationships and how that allows access, that creates paths and community. This is my friend's home again, who invited me out to document their annual. It's not a butchering. It's not a shearing. It's a branding of their cattle. And so to see how they took their resources that were available to them and create something that was specific to them was very interesting. But this notion of home for me, I grew up in Hunters Point, Arizona, and then transitioned to Rinderach when I was fairly young. And I didn't necessarily know how to embrace my community in that way. I grew up with the mountains around me, with the sheep, the open air in the sky, the juniper trees, and always had an imagination. Everything was in my backyard. I live on Beverly Hills Court in Rinderach, so that kind of says a little what you want with it. But with just down the road is the Rinderach National Monument, and at the base of that is the capital of the Navajo Nation with our tribal government. And when I was going to Albuquerque, making that transition to undergraduate school, I thought about offering a prayer of taking these lessons, this energy, and this passion that home has offered me. And I went to the Rinderach. And one thing that's very impressive to me is just the contrast that the rock naturally has, obviously with the red rock and the blue sky. But when you're standing at the base of it and peering through that window, it is transformative. It is grounding. And I hope that my imagery, or at least this particular image, can sort of reference that. And I'm sort of speaking off the cuff here because I believe that the image themselves does have 1,000 words, but not necessarily mine. And I take agency and take pride in being able to offer that and activating the imagery in that particular way, as opposed to just seeing, believing, and consuming. And I had the opportunity to work for the Navajo Nation government. I started off as an intern, and so I wasn't receiving benefits. But the supervisor at the time responded to my creativity, my perspective, and what I was hoping to create while I was in this position. And so I had a conflicting relationship with the Navajo Nation fair that happens in Rinnedarak and throughout the reservation. The parade and going to the fair was so cumbersome and was sort of always a burden for my family. I mean, due to lack of resources and just their own dichotomy in relationship and how they moved about. And so it was an opportunity for me when it came to me to create a float to be a part of the parade. And I thought, well, if I could make something that I would want to share with my community, it would be a rainbow. And this rainbow, specifically, at least the three colors here, as I referenced earlier, relate to the red dirt, the blue sky, and we are the light in the middle. Again, making that connection very similar to the Loom outline that you guys shared here, which is very inspiring in that way. But this particular piece is called Sovereignty. And within the Navajo Nation flag, there is an arching rainbow that oversees the land that references sovereignty. And I myself am very much interested and hope to uplift and empower those who are in the practice of visual sovereignty, choosing to self-determination and represent themselves in a particular way, whether that's culturally based, faith-based, spiritual, but also just through pure perspective. And within my work, I'm an emotional person. And I had the opportunity to fall in love. And it was in a place that I didn't necessarily expect, on the western side of the reservation, a place that I never knew, didn't know of, wasn't sure how the community was. And while I was getting to know this person, they were having a family gathering, as one does. So there was a butchery. And I was walking outside, just meeting people, trying to be a good in-law and helping where I could. And I noticed this particular scene in the trees, and I said, that's the shot. And I went back and asked them if it was okay. So I grabbed my camera, and all the in-laws are standing around me, like, why isn't he helping? It's just sheet hanging in the tree. We need to cook it. But I think growing up on the reservation, again, I'm trying to celebrate the beauty that exists of home, that not necessarily everyone values or sees in that particular way. Majority of the things that I've heard have always been external or outside of me, or someone interpreting that for me. I myself have now the agency, or at least the respect, to see it for what it can be and what it is for others. This next image is Emergence, and this is taken in Mexican Water, Arizona, on my way back from my commute from the in-laws. And whenever I would drive by, at least on the reservation, there's always something on the side of the road. I don't know how many times I've just had to grin and bear it and drive past things because I'm in a hurry, I have places to go. But if you could really just stop and spend your time and take a moment to reflect and see what your surroundings really have to offer, I think the image allows that, and it resonates and invites others to do the same. And this notion of creativity in unusual places, or aesthetics in unsuspecting sites, is fascinating to me, to see how, again, similar to the sheep, aesthetics within Diné culture can be transformed and transposed and ascribed to different objects by way of creation, speaking and sharing, or being a part of a gathering together. It has something to offer. And with respect to oral tradition, it is something within my practice I'm trying to incorporate and really own, and understand how what I have to offer through spoken word and history can be shared. It cannot be sold. It cannot be bought. It can be preserved, maybe by a label or an audio recording, but it will never have the essence of actually being there, of actually existing and being present in that particular space. This image here is Manuelito, and this is taken in Localized, Arizona. You can see the LA there on the building. That's not Los Angeles. The gentleman on on top of this little building. To the right is Chief Manuelito, and to the left is Barbencito, his brother. I myself am not sure who is the maker of this, but it's very interesting to me to just see how abandoned buildings and sort of public spaces is now an act of creative placemaking that allows for individuals to exercise their thoughts, their emotions. I mean, the reservation doesn't necessarily have galleries that you can go exhibit at. There's a museum or two here or there. There's a few workshops here or there with grassroots organizations, but where is an outlet? It is the loom. It is ceramics, but it's mainly relationships. It is connections. It is your perspective and your thought process that allows for that to come into existence. And that can exist anywhere, as it is existing here. And in addition to this, prior to the pandemic, I was traveling again within my government capacity to different parts of the community and reservation that I never really had a relationship with. And I was an observer. I was able to see different parts of it. I mean, here, this image, Our Nation, is taken in Chinle, Arizona during the Central Agency Fair. And this notion of nationhood, statehood, and identity seems to radiate from home. And we each carry that within us. And we have the privilege of knowing where we're from, who we are, and where our family members have come from. And I really love this image just because it's during the morning, the rising sun. So if you've ever been in a parade or fair, you know you have to get there early, right? But it's interesting to me to see how the rainbow is an imitation of light, and it reminded me of what I had created a year prior. But also you can see Spider Rock and sort of this makeshift hogan, the idea and notion of the Diné way of life, but through creation, through fabrication, through a reflection of what they have available and what they're hoping to share. This image to the left is a star, or son, which is taken in Shiprock, New Mexico. I wasn't necessarily able to really document as I was participating, handing things out to kids running at the float, which is very nerve-wracking. But at the end of the float, I was able to get on top of our little our float, I guess, and I saw a star glistening coming up down the way. It was the highest thing out of a sea of people, all this noise and commotion, and I just saw a star glistening coming forward to me. So I went to it and documented it, and to think about our relationship not only to land but also to the stars above us, and this grounding and sense of direction that it offers. I mean, we've existed since time immemorial, as did the elements. The image to the right is titled Peek, P-E-E-K. I myself, as a photographer, acknowledge the voyeurism, this idea of extraction, of taking, capturing, shooting. I mean, if you just think about the language utilized within photography, it is very, abrasive, problematic. I mean, you think of lighting equipment, there's master and slave. It's pretty interesting to me, and I acknowledge that within my work, and I think as Diné, I'm sure you've heard of last throughout this event, humor is very paramount in the way that we relate to one another, how we break down our egos and sort of ground each other. And with that, this is taken up on top of Buffalo Pass, just above Localized, where you saw the Manuelito building itself. And there in the distance is Shiprock. And knowing that I was traveling at the time and getting able to reconnect with my community and see it in a new way, came the opportunity to go home, literally, and stay there. This was taken in 2020 during the height of the pandemic. And this is Bluebird Backyard, taken in 2020, as mentioned. And at this particular year, I mean, I could have, I guess I'm just sharing this very openly, I could have taken the opportunity to just document what I saw, people in turmoil, unsure, our community being, shaken up, as was the world. And I thought it was a time to just observe, to learn, to feel, and to just be reminded of these intimate moments that, at least that's how I learned to create imagery, something that's very particular and personal to me. And my mom is a pretty good bread maker, but I think every Navajo person would say the exact same thing. But she has this idea that she likes to collect things, and these are bluebird flower bags that she's collected over the years, or maybe not the years, but the year, and decided to wash them and hang them up. And I just remember seeing at this particular time news agencies and publications coming out to the reservation during the summer when we had the highest COVID-19 infection rates. A lot of poverty porn and a lack of understanding. And I was just thinking, where's our visual sovereignty? Who is telling our story? Who is representing us? And I don't think it was necessarily the most important thing at the time as we were all surviving and trying to navigate this new moment in our lives. But, you know, just reflecting upon that, I thought the most beautiful thing that I could probably offer is just to watch and document the things that are closest to me, that have value to me, that have shaped me. And maybe then those who are at home within their own surroundings, within their own backyard, can do something similar and find peace with that. This image to the left is yucca, and the image to the right is Tutadine tails. And I've been interested as of late to my relationship to plants, the vegetation, not necessarily just landscape, but trying to identify Diné plants and their uses and the context in which they exist, and giving them a moment to be uplifted and acknowledged in the way that weavers definitely do and incorporate within their practice. This image on the left, you might recognize, Kevin, is taken in Shiprock at Graham's cornfield. And he's a good friend of ours within the community, but it was my first time since childhood being able to see a full cornfield. The last person who really planted was my grandfather, again, who I'm named after. And it was very serendipitous to see how, in a weird way, his family legacy led him to this particular point. And I wanted to document at least that awareness or that connection that I was seeing. And also just referencing the beauty and power that it has in the way that we use it within our ceremony and in our blessings and prayers. So moving to more recent work and some of the imagery that's been included within the exhibition. In October 2021, Hadley, Jesse, and I and Byron had the opportunity to go to different parts of the reservation and travel and document these sacred places and sites so that we can offer it and share it here to inform and ground the textiles within the exhibition. So as one does, we moved in a clockwise direction and started in Rinderach, a place that I know as home as the foundation of this particular adventure. And I think majority of individuals who are not familiar with the reservation know Rinderach from the front end, this iconic imagery, but not necessarily what it looks like inside, from the back side, from its side view. It's not necessarily the money-making image that you would want or the tourist idea of what you're seeing. But I think that's important to me to offer a different point of view, a different perspective, and also share that with individuals who I care about. This image is, again, speaking of iconic scenes and landscapes, this is of Spider Rock in Chinle, Arizona, in Canyon de Chelly. And within our journey here, we made a point to take the time to immerse ourselves within this experience, share stories and understanding, and offer our different interpretations of what we were, undergoing together. And it's been a really beautiful blessing within my life to reflect on it. I mean, just talking with Jesse over the past few days about how it resonates with us, even to this day, which again is the imagery that was created using a 360 camera, which is featured in the exhibition on the first floor. Whoop. Was that me? Cool. Thank you. So this is the camera that we utilized. This is taken, or at least this image was created in Monument Valley, where it's standing and sort of occupying this particular space. Prior to us taking on this venture, I myself, not that I'm all-knowing, have never seen immersive or 360 imagery of the Navajo Nation. Sure, we have like a Google card that comes once a few years that sort of documents the roads and streets, but never of the land, of the community, of the rural areas, or these parks, or these public spaces. And it's interesting to me to see how it sort of reads futuristic, but at the same time is sort of grounded just because of something that stands the test of time, which is the landscape in the surrounding area. And this image is the northern overlook at Monument Valley. Prior to this particular trip, I myself have never went into the park and explored. I've always just seen the three buttes, and that was enough for me. And, I got my image and I was like, okay, great. But when we ventured in, I was surprised. I was inspired. I felt like home. And to know that there was some divine energy surrounding us, and you can hear the echo incorporated into the musical composition developed by Connor Chi here of me sort of howling and just the echo reverberating off the different monuments throughout this particular place. This is an image that we made the point of stopping at. This is just outside Mexican Hat, Utah. This is Rapley monocline, and it follows the San Juan River. And doing some research into looking to these places, past individuals have referenced obviously this geographic formation that reminds them of Navajo weaving textile designs, primarily of wedge weaves is what I see. And it recalls a time when I was young in high school, teenage angst and everything. I would take my camera and go out, and I would just look. I would look at the different landscapes. I would look for patterns and colors and see how they're vibrating with one another. How did that get there? I mean, obviously, paying attention in earth science was probably the thing to have done in high school to have a little bit more appreciation for this. I mean, I'm now learning that now. But it's fascinating to me, similar to sheep and just the landscape around us. Time has interpreted this knowledge for us, especially with pastoralism. I mean, obviously, the sheep have taught us what to eat, what not to eat, what is medicinal, what is of use. And I think the land offers that, as well as the stars and the elements. This is an image of Shiprock at the base. I titled this Stronghold. I myself, again, didn't really have the opportunity to travel throughout the reservation, but once I did, and being able to relate and tie them to communities or people that I know who have shared that sense of self with me has been truly a blessing. And this is where we ended our trip during this particular time. And I remember Hadley gave me the opportunity to say something, or at least reflect on the journey. And I offered a prayer here. And I think people don't necessarily access these places, obviously, the way that people on the reservation can. But being able to offer and share that is something that's very intimate to me, very intimate to my colleagues and my community members here, because it is our home. It is the place that we call our own. It is our source of inspiration and strength, and is the thing that guides us. And when we say Diné Bakea, we mean the Diné, we as the people are standing upon the land. And if you're always connected between red dirt and blue skies and you are the light, home is always beneath you. It's within your heart. It's what you carry with you. And it can be in an image. This image here on the left, and with my final slide, is called Juniper Rainbow. And as of late, I'm thinking more elemental, thinking about ecological relationships and how I'm able to document light. It's so abstract, it's so all-seeing, you can't avoid it. And I'm just curious to see what the medium of the photographic image can offer in terms of trying to relate to that and document it. And I'm not going to read this, but I wanted to share it in terms of fundamental law that's incorporated through the establishment of the Diné government. And it speaks to thinking, planning, life, hope, strength, hajon, ina, beauty, balance, kinship, and life. Thank you.
How are we on time? Okay, on time. Great. So I would like to invite all of you to bring your chairs. We're going to do a sort of arc up here. Thank you to the presenters. As you've learned, I hope, This project is one that's really built on relationships. And so there are a few people I'd like to introduce to join us for the round table. Tyrell Tapaha, who's the fiber artist and weaver, and you'll hear his voice in the audio component in the gallery speaking about a few of the pieces in the exhibition. Kevin Aspis, another fiber artist and weaver whose work is featured and shaped by the Loom. Darby Raymond Overstreet, digital artist and printmaker. You've seen her Loom portrait in many of the promo materials for Shaped by the Loom, and she has many prints in the exhibition. And Connor Chi, if you would like to come up, you're welcome to. The music that you've been hearing was composed by Connor. He's a Diné composer and pianist, and he created a soundscape for the gallery. No, I'll stand.
Great.
Rather than asking you questions, I would like to use this opportunity to just open the floor to conversation and see if all of you have questions you'd like to ask one another based on what we've heard today. And then we'll open it up to audience Q&A as well.
I'll start. All right.
Nice.
Let me do this.
Thank you.
No one's going to take this. This is my worst fear in class when teaching is students who don't talk. So, all right, weavers. What in the world did I just put up on the slides earlier? What are your thoughts on what those weaving tools used by Diné people in the 1740s? What do you think they are? What do you think they're doing?
They're scrub oak, right? They're old scrub oak weaving tools.
Don't know.
I think they are. They
Okay.
are.
Like it.
They are scrub
Yes.
oak. Yes. And when we use our tools, we start off with softwoods, and then we go to hardwoods, and then we end with softwoods. And when I see those tools, a lot of it were shaped by the men in the family. And, and for us, we honor those tools. And when I saw those, I thought, the weaver that had those tools were fully supported by their families, and they've lasted a long time. And the other thing that really pops up too is that I've had a conversation with Venancio Aragon's brother, who is a tool maker. And Venancio had won the Best of Show at Santa Fe Indian Market. So, I had congratulated him, but I also wanted to congratulate Venancio. And I said, congratulations to your brother. He won the Best of Show. And he said, weavers get all the glory. The tool makers are never mentioned. And that was one of the things that I was talking with Hadley about, is when we put on a weaving show, we really have to honor the tool makers, because they're the ones who go out and see the structure of the tree, and what has fallen, they repurpose. And we carry that through our lives. We have tools that have been given to us by our great grandmothers. And just recently we found a batten that was made in Bosco Redondo and carried back to our family. And so that is in our family. And I think that without tools, we cannot weave.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting to think about, in part because, not to be a downer, right? But the world of the 16, 17, 1800s was often uncertain and violent. It kind of can slip by, but these were fortresses.
that people were living in and around and using because of Spanish folks, Pueblos, Utes, than the Americans. And I think in both these cases, it's telling that the tools were cached. They were hidden under rocks somewhere near the Pueblito, put aside to be protected for somebody to potentially come back for. And I think there's a larger story there. And so hearing you sort of remark on the fact that they are these cherished things, that they're passed down, they're heavily valued, adds another dimension to these things that have been sitting in a storage unit for a long time.
Yeah, no, and speaking to the importance of that, one of the lows of my week was I went over to Brooklyn to go watch the sunset on the East River. And en route, while taking the subway, I lost my first baton that I ever got. So if anyone sees a really nicely made stick, let me know. But like instantly, what came to mind, like I felt like I wanted to pool and have this kind of like pity party, but like in all honesty, it kind of came down to just like I wish I said goodbye. Like at least from again going to the importance that we have, they have their life, they have their vitality, and I look at them like individuals. When our tools break, at least I was told that we use them until they're not usable anymore, and when they reach that level, you take them back to the earth, you go bury them under a tree, and you give them that space and their time to live their life. And yeah, it's beautiful to see those pieces live on without the people there. I think that's a really frustrating part of navigating collections and archives, is that it's just such an integral part that we're missing to the storyline. And even without the people there to speak for the work, of the tools, they still have their voices.
Can I ask one more?
Do it.
All right. So what about the little lines on the second set of tools on the longer stick?
Yeah, I was telling Wade because we had a little excited moment. I was like, okay, cool. Here's all the thoughts that I had while you were talking. But particularly with the little lines, you see that in a lot of well-used tools. And like what Linda was saying is that when we get towards the top of the piece, you go back to softwoods. And so by that time in stage in the weaving, your tension is just increased because, you're working with such a small area. And you said that the batten was fairly like thin, right? Like
Yeah, so actually I was really interested. So yeah, it's hard to describe from the photos, but actually on the second floor, part of the collection has the tools. They're about similar dimensions.
Mhm.
We're talking what is it? It's headed on there. I forget. It's like a little over a meter. So, 3 feet or so, and like a centimeter in diameter, centimeter and change.
Wonderful. So yeah, what came to mind was that it was a finishing batten, and kind of going back into that high tension, those lines are created because the warp is pretty much indenting itself into the tool. And I don't know, a lot of my tools that I've inherited have those, or even with like the wider battens in the middle, like oftentimes they'll turn it like perpendicular to the warp, and so they'll end up getting these teeth marks very similar to the marks that you see in that piece that you found.
Oh, that's good to know. I thought it was like the weaver counting all their rugs.
And actually, those lines do create a hazard for your warps, because if they land in the wrong spot, it starts to erode your warps. And for us, Barbara is the main spinner in our family, and so she spins the warp. And our warp is comprised of wool and also a little bit of mohair. The mohair has to be a percentage of less than 10%, because if you go just a little bit above, it's not strong enough. If you go a little bit too low, it becomes really tough to spin. And so she has to hit it right on the mark, and it's amazing what her warps can do. And when my marks start to appear on my batten, I generally have to sand it off or give it to my husband to do. But he has discovered more harder woods, like exotic woods. And also he started to fashion some of our looms that way. And so when we travel places where the weather it kind of warps it, these exotic woods stay really firm. So I think we work with the environment that we're in. You know, and even though I prefer scrub wood from or scrub oak from the beginning, I'm really beginning to embrace the harder woods.
Thank you for that. One thing that came up in mind during your presentation, Wade, was seeing the progression, or at least the delineation of how the routes were diminishing over time by way of circumstance, social construct, and laws, and just seeing how that has influenced and changed the value and the relationship to herding. And I'm curious for weavers and everyone on the panel, how does one maintain value in a changing world? I mean, we spoke about not necessarily living in two different worlds, but um, having our internal sense of self and moving throughout the world. And as we continue to change and with technology, I mean, imagine AI is going to come up with some textile designs, I mean, real quick. But I'm curious, like, how can we as cultural bearers, as stewards and creatives, carry on these values, these traditions in a way that is not necessarily authentic, but is true to us and what we know?
Sure. I mean, we can honor the past. We're still embracing it, but you know, some of us have been pigeonholed into regional styles, and not of our own doing. We've been exposed to forced borrowing from the trading post owners, but I think that now, when Barbara broke out of the mold of doing just tuba hills, you know, we started embracing the 1800s, the grandmothers who wove, the grandmothers whose names are not attached to those weavings. And we honor them by tweaking their designs and using it as an educational tool. And that way we're adapting, but we're still living, we're still honoring the past.
I think for me, more often than not, I'm the runt of the litter in a lot of these situations. And so, you get a unique perspective being the younger person in the situation, as well as like a unique perspective and an assessment of why am I doing what I'm doing. Something that's been super alluring and captivating about this stream of knowledge and philosophy on my end is that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And something that's really powerful about the sheep to loom process, the ecology behind it is that it's functional, it's self-sustaining, and the further you deep dive into these certain routes, the methodologies of these certain people, the family, and the personhoods behind all of that, it starts to make sense. And I really admire Wade's like quantifiable data about that, because you hear it and you see this success, you see this legacy going on. Particularly like in our part of the reservation, like the Four Corners area, we have a really unique part of the res because we're in the San Juan River Basin. We're also part on the mountain chain, and I think about our little small mountain, the Carrizo Mountain, which is kind of like an off branch of the Chusca line. And you hear stories of 60 years ago. There's upwards of 200 families fully, operating work crews, pretty much. Upwards of 12 people staying at a camp at a year, and now we have like 5 families up on the mountain. We're all spread miscellaneously spread. We don't really communicate or chat other than like sometimes we get flocks mixed up. But when you spend time with these people, especially the ones who are still sticking around, they have just a wealth of knowledge of the specific, you know geospecific and family specific knowledge that's inherently endemic to their specific line of work. And going back into the idea of like, why are we doing what we do? I want to know more about what this picture was and what it meant to our people, and how can I integrate this in moving forward. The Southwest is in a unique platform of being in a really big ecological distress, as is most of the world. But you know unlike the rest of the world, in a lot of spaces that we as humans occupy, there's still streams of thoughts that are still really applicable and are really useful tools in moving forward.
Let's get into that part. One thing that I want to touch on, what Linda was saying, being pigeonholed into weavers being pigeonholed into certain regional styles. Me and Tyrell, speaking on our half, weren't pigeonholed into specific types of regional styles, and that's due to the part that a lot of the the generations before us did, encouraging us. You don't have to do this. We're you know we're basically doing the same styles, using the same techniques, same setup, same technology that our grandmothers used back when we received the gift of weaving. But now we're beginning to create what we see, what we document with Tyrell's pieces, bringing back old techniques like myself using wedge weave, but not being specifically tied into regional styles, not being told what to weave. We can weave what we want. What we see, and it's such a different dynamic from what do you say, the 70s, 50s to now, the trading post era. And I think it's it's intimidating at times because we have there's such a high standard of weaving that now Navajo families have produced, and trying to get to that level and say, hey, it's beautiful what they've done, what's been created, but now how do we make our mark? Um, Now in history, because now for weaving has transitioned, changed over time, over the hundreds of years that we've had this ability to weave, um, and we've adapted so many times, and it's just where do we fit into that? How do we transform, take now for weaving to another level, and what direction it's heading, and trying to get more young individuals, more young NAFO people involved in the process. So yeah.
I do have some thoughts on this, actually. Um, in the spirit of the original question, this is something that I've wondered about a lot because, as I pointed out, if you sort of generalize this graph of Navajo herding over time, it's sort of a normal curve where it starts from zero, it's arguably peaked, and it's changing into something that probably will never go away, but is reaching for some sort of asymptotic end, right? It's going to near zero, but it will never go away as long as people keep weaving and there's the demand for sheep. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of people don't herd sheep. It's our older relatives often. It doesn't have the same impact, or it's not economically important in the same way that it once was. And I've puzzled over this a lot as to, it's still a really important cultural touchstone. You're all here. We're here. We're talking about it. But you go onto like Facebook or Twitter and or Instagram and like the Navajo meme page. If we could pull this up and put the Navajo meme page on and just scroll through them, I would bet money that like 3/4 of the memes and things reference sheep herding in some way. Like in this sort of digital 21st century, I saw Hadley had quoted me. I wrote somewhere that I think it's, this is a really interesting point for me. The fact that sheep herding is still this really important cultural touchstone in Diné culture, even though the fact of the matter is like people under the age of, okay, let's say 30, but probably like older, so like 50, don't have as much direct experience with herding, particularly as like a livelihood. And that's fascinating to me because the sheep herder special. You can find things like, that's what people refer to the sandwich as, and they sell it. And there's this kind of cachet built up around the herder, the image of the herder, not necessarily the reality of like being out there 24/7. It's snowing, it's hot, it's raining, it's cold, whatever. It's hard work, and that part kind of gets glossed over in kind of the image of the herder. And I've wondered. I got a PhD. I'm an academic. I wondered about this a lot. I tried to write something and not super satisfied with it. But I think one of the things is echoing what Larissa pointed out in her paper is that I think herding is important and will continue to be important because it is one of the ways in the 21st century that Navajo people can reliably engage in those broader relationships between us and the rest of the natural world that are so fundamental to being a Navajo person. And that's what it once was being on the landscape, doing all these activities, engaging with the Diné in all forms and life in all forms. And now in a world where you can't look up from your phone half the time, or you have to be chased outside, or you drive in a car and things are easy. And I think that the herding lifestyle and kind of what it connotes for people is a reference back to that. But then also when you do it, then you are truly engaging in all those building activities that recenter you as a Navajo person. And I think that is why we'll never see it go away. And you hear people sometimes make arguments about like why rodeo or why some of these things that it allows men to be warrior figures. It allows, but I think herding is more accessible and allows anybody to be on the landscape in a way. And I think farming and the resurgence of farming that we've seen during COVID is a similar practice. And you're seeing more younger people going out and like planting fields for the first time in a decade or so since a grandparent passed away or something, because people are realizing, I think, that re-engaging with the land in different forms, whether it be herding or farming or just like getting out there and doing something, is central to being a Navajo person.
When I was growing up, my paternal grandfather, had over 300 heads of sheep. And that was his main job. He was also an expert horseman, where he would use his wagon to go to Gallup or to Farmington to get goods for the trading posts. And that's how our father, learned how to work in the trading posts. But our grandfather was mainly he was a sheep herder, and he would go up early in the morning and go outside and, start taking the sheep out and stuff. And I would sit and wait for him. And then I would see him coming over the cliffs or the hills, and I would run out there, and he'd put me in front of the saddle, and we would follow the sheep. And he would sing Hank Williams songs to me because that was his favorite, But he made a living with his sheep. He would shear all the sheep, and then he would take the wool to Gallup or Farmington and sell them. And from there, that's how they had money for their lives. As years go by, as he got older, and both our grandparents got older, the sheep started to die off. And by this time, my father was working at the trading post, and he would buy wool at the trading post and bring it home to my mom, and my mom would card and spin the wool, and that's how the source of our wool was from the trading post. And then both our aunts, they started to have sheep. So when they sheared the sheep, they would save the best parts of the sheep for me, because I was out there, with my wool, and and it was like after my grandparents both passed away, we really didn't see sheep. We would have an uncle who had some sheep, but not like how our grandfather had it, But a lot of the local sheep herders, when they shear the sheep, they would take the wool to the trading posts, and that's where a lot of us bought our wool from. And then later on, most of the sheep are dying off, but the trading post is still buying wool. Now what they're doing is they send them to mills, and they create roving wool, so they bring the roving wool back to the trading post, and you can buy the roving wool there, which eliminates the carding, which I'm very happy about. But it's still wool from the community, and it's still hand spun wool that we use now. So we're changing a lot, but we're also adapting to what our environment is, and then I've noticed, like, within the last 5-6 years, a lot of the young weavers are returning back to having flocks of sheep. and they're relearning how to spin, they're relearning how to card, and they're dyeing their wool and they're selling them, and I think that's amazing that, because during my era, a few of us were still carding and spinning our wool, whereas a lot of the weavers were just buying their, already commercial wool. They were buying that, and it was easy because no fault for them, because they have jobs. They have jobs, and then they weave on the side. So they have to eliminate the carding and the spinning, so they can make a living for themselves, So it's really nice that the young people now are seeing that and remembering that, and I'm really, it's wonderful to see that. So
Something that came to mind is I find it funny that of the people that I meet in my life, I find it I am one of the more impatient people that I know in my life, despite my profession. Um, but kind of speaking to the idea of nothing in life is ever granted to us. Everything is hard work. It's something that I really find silly but admirable about mainstream society, is the idea that we like making our lives more complex. We like adding fuzz and stimulus that kind of stray away and take our mind away from our tasks, from our lives, and from how to live that and approach that. And so much of what I've been learning and what I've been integrating in my life is taking these ideas, taking these thoughts from our families, from older people, and once you kind of dip your toes into it, you're pretty much already in the deep end. You're finding so many different new pathways, new ways of thinking, new ways of integrating. Like, you can't not be inspired by these spaces and not want to integrate and work more and add to the conversation. And honestly, I wouldn't be the person I am without weaving in my life. I'm 6 generations in. Our mentor / my granduncle Roy Cady, if you guys are not familiar, you should be. But he's an icon. He really did was a driving force in creating this new space of expression within weaving, and that's been, like I said, really invaluable. But also, it just makes me want to be a placeholder. I find it really funny that working in the arts, it's really easy to single out a face and to single out and to prize a person and be like, this is our new standard. This is what we're going to look to. But in all reality, we all contribute different things. We all contribute different legacies and tales. And that's why I do what I do. I want to know more of who we are, how we got here, and where we're going.
I just wanted to say something I think about a lot, and I'm inspired to say, listening to the conversations and kind of going back to what Larissa was talking about and how everything we do is based in our creation stories. And I think it's important to note that our creation's not over. We're still emerging. And so the things that we're adapting to is really, I think it's not going to be a problem of losing this tradition, because everything that we do is based in how we live our life and in this tradition. And, my grandpa will still sing his horse riding songs if he's driving his truck. And for me, I play piano, that's not a traditional instrument, but the music that I create is based in the culture. It's based in how I was raised. It's based on the songs that my Nelly man would sing. And so whatever the medium is, whether we're weaving the textiles or weaving pixels or weaving sound, it's all coming back to this place of who we are as a community. And whatever form that takes, it's coming from the same place. And now we are creating the stories for our future generations and the histories, and this is still part of our emergence. And so, we will always find our place in the world, because it's all based in the way that we were brought up and our ideals and beliefs that we had, from the generations in the past.
Yes. Thank you to all of you for being here today. Thank you for joining us. I hope you'll spend some time in the galleries